Hey everyone, bit of a different episode, just Adam here right now. Hunter is out panning for gold deep in the Yukon. What we're gonna do each month is actually share a recording from our community sessions, which are power half hours, where the entire community comes together and we just jam on a topic in competitive intel. So this episode's from a couple weeks back where Hunty and I hosted the session. We had about 50, 60 people join us live on how to use sales calls for competitive intel. Really fun session. You can join these sessions. They happen once a month too at the Compete Network. We actually have one tomorrow too, and Hunter will be back from the Yukon for it. And that's on the 5 questions you need to be asking your buyer. Great conversation. You can bring your expertise to the table, any burning questions you have too. And we actually take topics from the audience for the next session. So we will be back next week with a regular episode of Coffee and Compete. But without further ado, let's flip it over to Hunty, myself, and the whole community. All right, everyone. Welcome to Power Half Hour, our Friday ritual here at the Compete Network community. I'm Adam McQueen, content community at Klue. I'm actually holding my mic today because it's broken. And I'm joined by my favorite guy, Hunter Sones, the competitive enablement manager here at Klue. Hunter, what's going on, buddy?
Doing well. I'm very fortunate. I actually have a mic stand over here, so...
You're living large. I know, I'm chopped liver now. When we were prepping for this, Grayson, the man behind the scenes, handed me this. He gave you the whole beautiful stand, everything. He said, Adam, you can just hold this and make do with it. Excited to have Product Marketers and Compete pros wrapping up their Friday with us for a tight 30 minutes. Hunter, what's your favorite part about these community sessions before we jump into the content?
Honestly, I just love that they're short. You know, it's easy to just like jump in, talk about some stuff, have a good conversation about compete related topics, and then get on with your day. Like it's just nice to be able to, you know, chat with the community in sort of like a short form. So love that part.
But first of all, we like to do a little pin the question. The topic we are here for today is how to use sales calls for competitive intel. Very niche, but also incredibly powerful for folks that are in this role right now, because we all know there is a gold mine of intel in sales calls. So, Hunter, as the compete guy at Klue, the guy at Klue using Klue, you got any juicy tidbits that have come from recent sales calls?
So, yes, actually, there was one in particular. So this came up, this would have been like 2 or 3 days ago, something like that. It was one of our EMEA reps, and they were on a call. And basically, we launched a new feature a little while ago at Klue, and we've been, you know, using Gone calls to try and, you know, track, hey, how is this feature landing with prospects who are seeing it for the first time? And so I, you know, went back, reviewed this call, and it was basically our prospect who was talking about how this is a major differentiator for us, it was great to see that. So there were 2 things that I gleaned from this call. It was 1, how was this feature actually being demoed? So what did the rep actually do to tee up this feature? And then 2, what was the reception? You know, what was the buyer saying about this being a differentiator? What were the pieces that really resonated with them? And then that is going to be shipped into a battle card for reference material for our internal sellers. So that was a juicy piece of intel that I got recently.
How recent was that?
That was, like 2 or 3 days ago, something like that.
Really? So how often frequency of like good intel you're getting from sales calls right now? What's that looking like? Because when we were chatting behind the scenes for folks, we were sitting next to each other in the office, and I nudged you on this and you're like, oh, perfect. I literally stumbled across something yesterday.
Yeah, multiple times a week. And it's, you know, there's a spectrum of what good looks like, but, you know, there's a few different things that I'm looking for in calls. It's, you know, what's the buyer saying about, about competitors, about new features, about, you know, differentiators. So there's kind of that side, but it's also what are sellers doing? You know, how are they handling objections? What do best practices look like for that? How are they pitching certain features or talking about certain value props? So there's always something good that you can glean out of insights from Gone calls, from call recordings, if you're able to find them.
Before we jump into the content itself, I did want to share, Hunter, related to this, obviously sales calls are a huge goldmine for competitive intel. We recently released integration with Gong. Hunter, do you want to do just a really quick 60-second overview of what that is, how folks can use it, and then we'll jump into this content.
Here, I'll give you kind of like a high level rundown of, what's the feature, why did we build this in the first place, and then I'll even take you through a really quick demo. It won't be very long, but we'll hop into a couple of visuals here. Basically, the idea is, gong calls and call recordings in general are a gold mine for product marketers, for competitive intel folks. There's tons of good stuff in there about what your buyers are saying about competitors, what, sellers are doing to respond to competitive objections. There's just tons of good stuff in there. The challenge, though, is, Gong is really built for sellers, for sales leaders, for sales enablement folks, not necessarily for, product marketers and competitive intel folks. So we built the Gong integration at Klue, the Gong Insights module, to basically, better serve product marketers and competitive intel folks, help them find competitive intel and action on it from Gong calls really quickly. So let me go ahead and share screen here. I can take you through sort of a very high level demo. So this is the Sales Call Insights module. So there's a few different things to note here. Up top, you've got competitor mentions by buyer. So you're tracking the competitor mention frequency over a period of time. This is just a demo space, so keep that in mind. But we've got all of the different major competitors down here that we're tracking. And then down here, we can actually see a full list of different calls where competitors showed up. We can sort by a few different things here. Number of mentions is what I've got this set up with. So if I click into one of these, I can really easily, summarize. I can see what was mentioned about these competitors. So I can see Pied Piper, Square, Stripe. These were the competitors mentioned in here. And then I can go down and start to see, what specifically did the buyer say about the competitor. So keep in mind, this is not what the seller is saying about the competitor. All of these mentions are brought up by the buyer. So this actually helps you understand, at a glance, what buyers are saying about competitors, what they're feeling about certain things, maybe competitive objections. There's a lot that you can pull out of these. So really the challenge, that a lot of folks run into is there's just an overwhelming number of calls to stay on top of where there are competitor mentions. And it's really, really difficult to figure out which calls to prioritize. And so that's why we built this. You can now find, all of the calls that had competitor mentions brought up by the buyer. You can filter down by that. You can see competitor mentions over time, see which competitors are trending up, down, or staying flat. So lots of benefits to this integration here.
Sweet. And if you are tuned in, you're a customer and you don't have this hooked up yet, reach out to your CSM, connect that. And if you're just kind of more interested in what the heck this is, go to klue.com/gong integration. You can check out a ton of information there, walk through that Nevadic tour yourself. But what you mentioned there's a couple like workflows that you've been using Klue and Gong integration for. Not everyone uses Klue. Not everyone uses Gong. There's different levels here. And so I would love for you to kind of walk through first some of these kind of key workflows you're doing for anyone that's just starting from scratch, trying to figure out how the heck to use sales calls to actually dig, analyze, and enable for competitive intelligence.
Yeah, 100%. So I guess like to give you the really high level here, there are three things that I will typically use Gong calls or, Gong call insights, using Gong and sales call recordings to find competitive intel. There are three things that I'm looking for. So the first thing that I'm using it for is monitoring. So it's actually tracking which competitors are showing up more frequently in calls and which are starting to show up a little bit less. So this is really helpful for staying on top of, new competitors that might be emerging. It's a bit more of a leading indicator to see which competitors are showing up more in calls rather than just focusing on which competitors are showing up in the CRM. One, CRM hygiene's not always great. And then, two, it shows up a lot earlier. You can see when, competitors are being brought up in like intro calls, early stage demos, things like that. So being able to monitor competitors is really important. The second is also, I guess, like subset of monitoring, seeing which deals are most competitive. So at Klue, this is maybe a little bit different from a lot of other companies, but we do direct deal support. We don't necessarily come on the call and, differentiate or anything like that. That's for our sellers to do. They're well trained. But we will do some strategy sessions with the seller behind the scenes to figure out how we can, navigate really competitive calls. And so being able to see which calls are really competitive before that even shows up in the CRM is a really interesting way of being able to do that. So that's the first, is monitoring. The second is research and analysis. And there's two things that I'm looking at under research and analysis. I know I'm kind of getting into the subtopics here, but, I'll do my best to keep it high level. It's what are buyers saying about competitors? And two, what are sellers doing to respond to competitive objections or lean into value props? And so this is really helpful for a few different reasons. Is there new intel that we can glean from what buyers are saying? Are they letting things slip about competitors? Are they, talking about the FUD that a competitor brought up? Lots of different things that we can pull out of those, maybe even pricing sometimes. And then two, on the seller side, I really want to understand, what are our sellers doing? What are they saying? And then this kind of leads into the third major bucket, which is enablement. I want to be able to take proof points, around what buyers are saying and add those into our battle cards. I want to be able to take best practice talk tracks from our sellers and put those into our battle cards as enablement materials. And then sometimes I might just want to take, a variety of those different things, put them into a Klue battle card, and then, share that with the sales team and have a discussion. Hey, how do we feel about these talk tracks that we're using? This is a new objection that's come up. How should we handle this as a team so that we can create better enablement materials? So there's a whole bunch of different things that we would use gong calls for. So again, it's monitoring, it's research and analysis, and then three, it's enablement. So those are the three buckets that you can use gong calls for.
So as I'm looking in the chat, and folks, when people shared here some like the juiciest intel, I'm gonna maybe toss a couple of these to you, Hunter, about what would you do with this? And if you're one of the folks as well, maybe you want to share a little bit of like, what do you do when you stumble across this kind of information? How are you then actioning it or kind of digging into like how you would use this? I see at the bottom here, Kathy, one of my favorites, always a mainstay of the community, mentioned there was a deposition talk track that she stumbled across that was all lies. I don't know, Kathy, if you're saying it's from what a competitor said to a buyer and was being recited back, or one of your own salespeople using a depositioning talk track that was all lies. But Hunter, I'm curious your take looking at that one, because that one really caught my eye.
Well, I mean, the way that you would handle that is very different depending on which of those two scenarios it is. If it's the seller and maybe they're saying something that is no longer accurate, that's a really good opportunity to maybe like go out and tap the seller directly, or even to talk to the sales manager and make sure that, there's a strong process in place for them reviewing the battle cards and making sure that they're not going off script. So that's sort of the first situation. The second is if it's the buyer saying something that is just completely inaccurate. It's FUD that they've heard from the competitor or something like that, but it's just false. And you know what? Sometimes we hear that. We hear of competitors who are, saying things that might not be totally accurate, in which case you might need to have that conversation with the buyer to point out some of those differences, or maybe you even need to throw in, some type of landmine question. Hey, go back to the competitor, verify this yourself. These are three things to look for that will help disprove that point. So, a bit different depending on the situation, but those are maybe some approaches you'd want to take.
I'm seeing some other ones as well, as Valerie and Penny are sharing some comments here. They were both kind of mentioned two interesting tidbits here on like putting stuff into action, this enablement side. And Valerie, Queen of Win-Loss, one of the best out there doing it, mentions using like these quotes from win interviews and then added them into a battle card. Because I was creeping over your shoulder on your compete work yesterday, Hunty. I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart, working in win-loss, incorporating, making these insights actionable. Give me your take on that, using win interviews, different ways that you're probably thinking about doing that to yourself in your role.
Yes, I love doing that. Putting a buyer quote into a battle card, that's one thing. And that's always helpful. It's great. It is coming directly from the buyer. Taking a snippet of what the buyer said and using that as, training material or including it in a battle card as just context for the seller is so powerful. And it's powerful for a few different reasons. One, the seller doesn't have to read it. A lot of folks, they want to consume content really quickly, sort of on the fly right now. And so just being able to like click a video and watch it, you can consume the content a lot faster. The second, though, which I think is a lot more important, is it gives the seller a lot of context around the tone of what the buyer is saying. So if the buyer in a win-loss interview had said something like, hey, we really love you guys for XYZ reason, and this is how you compare to your competitor, like understanding how they're saying that and how it's coming across. Were they like really jazzed up when they said it, or did they say it just like absolute, deadpan? That matters a lot. And so being able to provide sellers with that context, I think it also gives them some like almost like experience to lean on when they're having conversations with their prospects. So I'm a big fan of video from win-loss interviews going into battle cards as sort of training material and reinforcement material.
What I like about what you've been doing a little bit too, and this is where you're kind of tapping into my content heart, is these like short snippets too. The way we even had to use one of our video editors to help cut up these quotes to be like boom, 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 get to the point as quickly as possible. We know sharing these things out, it's can you get to the TLDR with as much context as quickly as possible? And using video, it's just so sticky to do so, I think. But you still need to be able to, when you look at video stuff, there can be some mumbling, some hms, some ha's, some kind of meandering points. But if you can just tighten that up, you're dialed. I also noticed Penny in here mentioned another thing that I've seen you've been doing, Hunty, is gong snippets in a standalone section within your bi-weekly newsletter. For folks in attendance that might be newer to the world of Compete product marketing, competitive intelligence newsletter is one of the biggest tools you have in your toolkit to keep your entire organization up to date on what's happening with your competitors, market, buyers. But I know you've been doing something similar to this, Hunty, so take this one away.
Yeah, I mean, literally taking a gong snippet and adding that into either like the newsletter standalone, like, hey, here's the gong snippet to check out. Or sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a few different snippets that are kind of talking about a similar thing. And I'll add those into a Klue card, and then that Klue card will, link out from the newsletter. But yeah, trying to like stir up conversation. Here's what buyers are saying. Here's what sellers are saying about, new features, that type of thing. I think it's a really powerful tool to send out in the newsletter and spark up some conversation, some collaboration.
I'm a big fan of the newsletter now. And anytime you can add different components into that and hook people in, you're getting more and more people leaning into the work you're doing, the content you're creating. Folks are kind of interested in the Gong trial, kind of how to use Gong best. I'll ask this question to the chat too and flip it to you, Hunter, as well. I think there's a big piece around, and we got a lot of questions ahead of time around there's a lot of information, right? How do you, if there's a lot of stuff coming in from sales calls, how are you even like parsing through all of it? And Hunter, what are you doing to kind of consolidate this too much information problem that is I'm not gonna say problem, but it's something that we're always navigating in this space, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think very candidly, that's why we built Gong Call Insights. It's because when you're, sort of using Gong standalone, it's a bit challenging to deal with the overflow, the overwhelm of all of that information. That said, if you're not set up on Gong Insights and that integration, or you're not using Klue, there are a couple workarounds. Like one, you can set up Gong trackers, and you can even set up Gong aliases. So, only send, or basically like email me links of Gong calls that, the buyer mentioned the competitor, and, they picked up on all these different aliases for any misspellings. So that's one way of doing it. The challenge with that, though, is you're probably going to get a lot of information, and not all of that information is going to be the highest quality. So I think it's one of the workarounds. It's not perfect, but it's something that you can do as sort of like a temporary fix.
What about the analysis side of things here as well? Like, so we mentioned there's a lot going on. How do you even know where to find things? But a couple of the questions, I'll even read some of the questions that came out ahead of time from the audience here, was like, if you're using something like AI to do transcript analysis, how are you managing accuracy, maybe identifying edge cases? Where are you digging to find hard to find insights? There's a whole kind of question here of like trust, reliability, but also the need for speed.
I think part of that can be addressed through Gong trackers. The other side of this, like when we're talking about edge cases, for example, I would say like heavily rely on your sellers. Let them know, here's specifically what we're looking for. These are the types of calls that are important to us. You probably will have to make this like more of a concerted effort going to sales meetings and talking about this stuff. I don't think that like one simple Slack message to the sales channel is going to do it. But yeah, trying to rely on sellers to actually crowdsource really good Gong snippets, I think is a really powerful way of doing that. Again, mentioned this is exactly what we're looking for these competitors. If you come across these types of snippets, please send them into the Intel channel or send them to me directly. That can be a powerful way of getting around that.
I like this in the chat here too from Lisa. Scheduling some of these calls, maybe ones are competitive. Maybe there's been a lot of mentions, I'm assuming, or something you could indicate are the ones you really want to sit in and watch. Even doing like a viewing party on these calls, personally, as someone that's not directly in Product Marketing and Compete, doing something like that where you could just sit in on these calls, it's just like breaks the barrier of the marketing bubble so much. I was actually just walking by our own VP marketing, Katie, yesterday, was sitting through, because she's just working on some other pieces, but was like sitting and listening to calls. She's like, Adam, did you hear about this? Did you hear what the buyer said about this? And I think just being able to just sit in on these calls just gives you this like lens in that often you can sometimes get removed from. And I mean, it's the point of sitting in on these calls so much. You know, I've got a question actually, and maybe I'll share this one as well for folks in the chat. I'm curious if anyone's doing something like this, but when you're looking through a sales call for competitive insights, there's so many different stages to a deal. Could be early demo. It could be stuff that's coming up in like that negotiation stage. It could be like one component. You're seeing competitive mentions come up a lot. I'm curious how folks navigate maybe competitive mentions at different stages of a deal, things that they're starting to pick up more frequently at an early stage compared to a late stage, and how they kind of navigating that. And Hunter, I know that's something that you've been kind of poking around in, as well as like what's coming up more early stage, what competitors versus like kind of these different stages of the deal cycle.
Yeah, I'm curious to get the community's take on this, but this is something that we're starting to play around with more and more at Klue. The reality is that at different stages in the deal cycle, there are going to be different people who are involved. Very early stage, you're probably going to be looking at SDRs who are involved in the deal, you know, and you might be looking at what are they saying on cold calls? What are they saying on intro calls? And then you start to get into the first few demos, the first few conversations. You want to start to pick up on, you know, this is really where I think a lot of the meat can be, which is, what are sellers saying in demos? What are buyers saying once they've seen the competitor's demo and are a bit more informed? And then when you start to get into the later stages, what are the types of objections that might be coming up, and how are your sellers handling those? I'm
curious as well for community take on this one. I'm really interested in how you can. I think there's a huge unlock here if you can start to parse through these different stages and like filter the intel that's coming out in that way. Hunty, I know we got a couple minutes left here too. So if folks have any final questions before we wrap here as well, drop them in the chat. But Hunter, give me some closing thoughts on just working in general with sales calls.
Well, I think that they can be an extremely powerful tool for getting sellers actually more engaged in the Compete program. Like, this is something that, of course, like gong calls are going to be an incredible source of intel for, you know, informing your differentiators, informing your talk tracks and things that you're going to be including in your battle cards. But, you know, this conversation around, you know, the movie night, that kind of idea, like, being able to take calls, put those in battle cards, or just straight up bring those to your sellers, they often like hearing, you know, either what they're doing well or what their teammates are doing well, or, you know, things like that. They just kind of love the collaboration on the sales team. So anytime that you can foster collaboration with gong calls, gong snippets, and sort of like bring best practices or bring discussion points to the team, I think it's a very, very powerful way of driving more engagement with the Compete program.
Hunty, appreciate you as always. Folks, if you have any other questions, comments, shoot us a DM. Shoot Hunter and I a message on LinkedIn. Connect with us. Connect with others you've seen in the chat that are sharing ideas too. That's the whole purpose of what we're doing here. We've got some other stuff as well coming up. So folks, before we hop off, there'll be customer mentorship coming up in late August around this, specifically how to use Klue and Gong. So if you're a customer, you're curious about what that would actually look like, go check that out. We've relaunched the Coffee and Compete podcast with yours truly and Hunter here as the co-host. Please go check that out and subscribe. I'm really proud and excited for the content we're creating there. And we also have a killer session hosted on the Marketect, which is a show on the Compete Network around putting your messaging into action with Emma Stratton and Devin Reed. So we've got a ton of cool stuff coming up. Folks, thanks for chopping it up with us for 30 minutes. I hope this is a good way to end your Friday, and we'll catch you all in a month from now. Thank you.